process. We would be remiss if we did not acknowledge the unprecedented situation we are all facing, both professionally and personally. We hope that you and yours are safe and healthy. And we would also like to thank you for the work that you all are doing to keep your agency's missions moving forward under difficult circumstances. At GSA, we are absolutely committed to sharing resources and providing you with information during these critical times. We have set up a website that you see as a hub of information. This page will be continually updated as we move forward and through this situation. Thank you and stay healthy. All right. Good day again to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Dave Hofstetter, and I'm the Regional Service Delivery Officer here in Region 4, Southeast Sunbelt Region, Atlanta. Before we begin today, I do want to let everyone know that we are recording this session. We post archived Client Enrichment Series videos on our YouTube channel, and you can access more than 24 past sessions anytime, day or night. Today we are taking a look at the capital plan formulation and the budget cycle. We will cover a day, actually several years, in the life of a prospectus level capital program project, from identification of need and development of the project at the regional level to its submission to, evaluation of, and integration into GSA's budget at the central office level, and its travels through OMB and Congress. Your expert speaker today to guide you on this journey is Diane Campanelli. Diane serves as the Chief Capital Budget Allocation Officer in the Office of Portfolio and Customer Engagement. As the agency's lead executive in charge of GSA's capital investment program, Diane and her team are responsible for the development and submission of GSA's annual $2.3 billion capital investment program budget request and $11 billion five-year plan. She and her team coordinate the needs of customer and inventory nationwide, working closely with PBS business lines and headquarters leadership. She is also responsible for working with OMB and GSA's authorizing and appropriations committees in support of and funding for the program. Prior to joining the Capital Allocation Division, Diane was a lead asset manager in the Mid-Atlantic region, Region 3, Portfolio Management Division, and a facility planner on the planning staff. Diane is an Excellence in Government Senior Fellow with the Partnership for Public Service, and she holds an MBA from LaSalle University. Before I turn the presentation over to Diane, I'd like to share a few housekeeping instructions. Once again, please be aware that we are recording this session. We have a great YouTube channel with dozens of archived Client Enrichment Series recordings, and we encourage you to check that out. We will post a link to our channel in the chat. We have automatically muted your audio to help us control the sound quality of the presentation. If you experience any issues with your audio and you have called in or had the system call your phone, try using the listen-only option to broadcast the presentation through your computer speakers. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the chat pane. You can find it on the right side of your screen. Type your question or comment in the box, and your fellow attendees and our team of subject matter experts will see your question. We hope to encourage an interactive dialogue using this feature. We will try to address all questions during the session today, either in the chat or as part of the presentation. Any questions that we are unable to get to today will be noted, and all questions will be answered and posted on our website. If you prefer to suppress the chat feature, you can click on the four-headed arrow at the upper right-hand corner of your presentation share screen to maximize your screen view. Should you have a question or comment, you can toggle right back to the chat pod by hovering over the upper right-hand corner of your screen and selecting the four-headed arrow again. Then the chat will reappear. With that information in mind, I'm going to throw this presentation over to Diane.
Good morning. Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for joining. I'm going to share my screen again. I know there's an awful lot of folks online, and as David mentioned, we're going through some extraordinary times now. It's a little taxing for our system. I'm hoping you can all see the screen now. I'm just going to check in with my folks. Monica, can you all see the screen?
Yes. Yes, Diane, I can see it. This is Dave.
Thank you. Wonderful. Again, I just want to echo Dave's sentiments earlier. I do hope everyone is staying safe, staying healthy. And again, GSA is here and will continue to update and provide information for our customer agencies during this most unusual, most difficult time. As David mentioned, I've been working on the capital program for years out of the Philadelphia area, starting as an asset manager and now working in the Washington, D.C. office. I'm going to take you through several slides to discuss the capital investment program, GSA's budget development, prospectuses, our interaction with our stakeholders, our interactions with you, our customers. And throughout this, we'll pause to try to address some questions. I know you all have the ability to enter some questions in chat. We're also going to take a few polls throughout our presentation to get a sense of your involvement or familiarity with the topic. So I'm going to get started. The first screen we have up, the first slide, talks about GSA's budget development. I'd like to focus, I'm sure this looks familiar for a lot of agencies with regard to funding streams. I'm going to try to highlight the details with GSA's budget. As you know, GSA is a quasi-revolving fund federal agency. What we do is we receive approval from Congress to ultimately utilize appropriations, but GSA receives our funds in the form of rent from customer agencies. You'll see we have the Federal Buildings Fund, and those dollars are used for multiple budget activities within our operations. We're going to focus particularly on the two in the bottom left-hand side of your screen, BA 54, BA 55, and BA 51. BA is budget activity, and we'll get into a lot more detail on this. The concentration of this program is our capital investment program. And as you see, GSA's capital investment program is one of several activities that is funded via what we call the new obligational authority provided by Congress. On an annual basis, we are provided these appropriation funds from the Federal Buildings Fund. You can see this from the Federal Buildings Fund. And along with other executive branch agencies, we follow administration guidance when developing our annual budget request. And GSA's annual budget request is typically, as I mentioned earlier, It's known as what we call a zero net budget authority, which means that our budget request for a given fiscal year is equal to the expected level of rent that we collect from our agencies. So on an annual basis, GSA receives approximately $10 billion in rent from its customer agencies. And again, that $10 billion that we receive on an annual basis is utilized throughout these various budget activities. We'll concentrate on 54 and 55 and 51. I won't touch really too detailed on BA 53 or 61, but I'll just want to introduce you to those activities. The chart that you see here is a representation of GSA's fiscal year 2020 budget. Again, from the federal building funds with the rent we receive from our customer agencies, those funds are expended through various activities. You can see here in terms of size that approximately $10 billion is deposited into the FBF, and depending on when leases expire or we dispose of a building or we construct new, that $10 billion could fluctuate. Of that $10 billion collected, the majority of that is used to pay the government's contractually obligated payments to the private sector, this light blue section we call rental of space. And that's for payments for leases that we lease on behalf of customer agencies. This represents over half of PBS's budget each year, and it also represents approximately half of the total square footage controlled by GSA. The next largest portion of this pie, if you will, accounts for our BA 61, our Budget Activity 61, or our building operations. This account is used to maintain service and support for our federal tenants in owned and leased space. It includes cleaning, utility, maintenance, and building services. The third slice of the pie, this large final FBF expense, is the capital program. This is where I'm going to concentrate the discussion today. And it's annually, that capital program request to Congress that Dave had mentioned at the outset is approximately $2 to $2.3 billion a year of the estimated revenue collected, $10 billion. We plan for 5 years through statute and with the Office of Management and Budget for approximately $11 billion. But this 2.311700 that you see on the screen, these dollars are needed to address customer requirements and the inventory. And just a few quick stats on that. GSA owns approximately 1,500 federal buildings nationwide, representing over 180 million square feet of space that you all are housed in. The average age of those assets is close to 50 years. In terms of leasing, we lease approximately space in 7,000 assets and over 183 million square feet of space. I mentioned earlier, sometimes our revenue will fluctuate on an annual basis. One of the reasons could be lease expirations. Of the amount of space that's rented, the 183 million square feet, approximately 60% of those leases will be expiring before FY 2023. GSA's options are for continuing agency need, continue to lease space, utilize space in federal buildings, existing federal buildings, propose new construction, solicit acquisitions, develop alternative solutions for the customer agencies. Just want to give you a quick look back and a look ahead, if you will, as to what GSA's budget request for the capital investment program has been over the past several years. You'll see we try to represent fiscal year 2016 through fiscal year 2021. And the top part of the chart will show you that on an annual basis for each of these programs, we request in the billions approximately $2.5 to $2.1 billion, averaging this out over the past couple of years, to support our capital program. And those funds are utilized for new construction opportunities, repairs and alterations, and repairs and alterations could be the actual construction repairs, it could be design only, and it could also be our special emphasis programs, which I'll touch on in a few minutes. We also have funds within the capital program to address what we call minor repairs and alterations, which we'll get into as well. But on an annual basis, we're requesting funds in the capital program, similar to that little slice of pie that we spoke of earlier, to address the needs of our inventory nationwide. The next segment of this slide will show you exactly how much has been provided in terms of appropriations or in terms of what we call spend plans or transfers. And they're pretty unique. We'll touch on them later in the presentation. But if we look specifically at fiscal year 2016, for example, GSA requested $2.5 billion to support our annual capital investment program. Congress appropriated $2.3 billion that year, the difference of approximately $162 million. Looks pretty good. Of course, devil's in the details on these. 2016 was an unusual year for us in that Congress appropriated close to $1 billion that year for new courthouse construction, while GSA and the courts and court-related agencies were very grateful for that much-needed appropriation. It also put on the back burner some of the other projects and building repairs that we had requested in that given year. So it looks like we were funded at a good level in 2016, not necessarily at the level and for the projects we asked. But you can see as you scroll along the bottom, the difference in appropriations in 17, 18, 19, and 20, pretty significant in terms of what we've identified as need and requested in funding and what we've received in terms of appropriations. We're all waiting to hear what happens with our FY 2021 budget. GSA is hopeful. It's submitted a program for $2.125 billion for 2021 to undertake those necessary BA 54, BA 55, BA 51 projects. So more to come on that. Before I get into an annual budget request and additional details, I'm just going to pause for a second, just check in with Monica or David to see if we have any questions, any comments that we want to address before we proceed.
We do not have any questions at this time.
Okay, good. All right, we're going to move next. And as David mentioned, too, in the introduction, when we talk about capital program, we're going to talk about the program itself, how projects are identified, how we select projects, and move it through the process of review. The capital program, did we lose my connection?
Yes.
That's what it appears, yes. Oh, there it is. It's back.
Is it back up?
Yes, it's back
Yes.
up.
Okay, good. So I'm going to take a second here. We'll talk about capital program areas, and we've touched on these briefly. And right after we talk about this, I'm going to turn it back over to David for a quick poll question to engage the audience to see how many folks have been familiar with this effort. So the capital program, again, annual request. We talked about BA 54, 55, 51. Our program covers new construction in support of Customs and Border Patrol for land ports of entry, new construction for the U.S. courts, as I mentioned with our FY 2016, we had that large infusion. There's also other new construction projects GSA puts forward in requests, including acquisitions, if we have the opportunity to purchase a building that we had been leasing, or if a building comes on the market that could meet a need. You may all have seen news of GSA acquiring the Department of Transportation headquarter lease in Washington, D.C. It also includes remediation. The federal government owns sites that have been either provided to us through the Department of Defense, or we have a very large campus out in Lakewood, Colorado, where we need to undertake some remediation efforts. We will secure funding through our capital program to address those remediation needs. Minor repairs and alterations, that's the BA 54 we spoke of earlier. Therefore, the ongoing day-to-day operations of our buildings, where we want to keep our buildings reliable and operable while accommodating changes in tenant space between major decisions to possibly modernize, renovate, or dispose of a building. This is the everyday engine for folks to keep the buildings up and running, undertake smaller repairs. We're going to touch on what distinguishes between a minor repair and a major repair shortly. I mentioned we have special emphasis programs, major repairs and alterations to address what we'll call buckets of projects or project types. Seismic mitigation, minimizing seismic risks within buildings. Consolidation activities program. Some of you may be familiar with GSA's efforts to support agency consolidation, either out of lease space or within a federal building, to efficiently utilize their space, improve their utilization rates, save money for the agency, save money for the taxpayer. We also have a special emphasis program for fire protection and life safety, which addresses risk mitigation, fire-related risk mitigation, replacement of fire alarms, sprinklers, egress, fire stopping. We have a judicial court security program which allows GSA to, in concert with the Administrative Office of the Court, to address security issues at courthouses, not necessarily space-related issues which may result in the need for a new construction for the U.S. courts, but to address those security issues, prisoner movement, egress, work with the United States Marshal Service. Again, seismic, we treat seismic with regard to whether or not it would be structural or non-structural upgrades, but we could use seismic funds to tie off equipment, secure bookcases to the walls, etc. And then we have our major repairs and alterations program, which, as I had mentioned before, it could be a request to design a future project. It could also be a request to design and construct in one given year, funding a major repair and alteration in our building. Undertake systems improvements. Repair the facade. Replace the roof. Repair and upgrade the plaza. All those systems within our building to make the building watertight, airtight, fully functional and operational for our tenant agencies. I'm going to pause a minute, let David hit you all with a poll question, because we're going to talk about, in a minute, we're going to talk about that distinction between major and minor, and we're going to talk about prospectuses. So David?
Yes, and before we get to the poll question, Diane, we do have another question for you, if we could.
Sure.
How do you determine when GSA pays for major alterations or repairs versus when an agency pays for them?
That's a great question. I'm going to ask too, and maybe this is something Andrew we could provide the link. My organization, the Office of Portfolio Management and Customer Engagement, my group works on the capital program, but we also have a pricing policy team that works within the overarching portfolio management and customer engagement. There is a pricing desk guide that's issued, and we have pricing experts that would be able to answer a variety of pricing issues. But our pricing desk guide gets into very specifics, which agency is responsible for, is this a GSA-funded project, or if it's an agency-funded project. So without speaking out of turn for what those experts would be able to tell you, I will tell you this. When GSA comes forward with our annual budget request, in concert with the Office of Management and Budget, we will put forward a request for funds that support what we identify, again, through pricing in coordination with the customers, what we identify as PBS, or Public Building Service, responsibility funding needs. So if perhaps we have a project for a customer where the agency wants to restack their occupancy in a building, and while we're restacking it because it's possibly presenting the opportunity for us to, for the agency to reduce the amount of space that they rent in the building, saves dollars in their rental account, also helps facilitate their operations and their mission. So if we have that while we're reducing space and while we are taking advantage of this time to perhaps upgrade systems, etc., we have what's called, and I'm hopeful most of you all are familiar with, we have shell improvements, those things within the buildings that GSA is responsible for, systems, shell work, etc. We have tenant improvement allowances, both custom and general. And again, based on an agency's tier, it's determined, how much of the work would be the responsibility of GSA to fund and how much of the work the agency would need to contribute. So in the case of my example, if we have agency X, for example, consolidating in a space, we would work the cost estimate to say, okay, what's the actual program requirements for the customer agency? How do they translate into dollars, the scope of the project? And GSA's request would support the funding needed to address shell items and the general tenant improvements that pricing allows, as well as custom tenant improvements up to an agency's tier. Typically above an agency's tier, if an agency's requirement is coming in and it's beyond that which pricing would say GSA would fund, we would say to an agency, we're going to put forward a request. The entire project based on your program or requirement and based on your vision for this project and what we've developed through our requirements. The entire project will cost, I'll say, $100 million. GSA, shell, general TI, custom TI up through the tier is about $85 million. You, customer agency, would need to bring or secure within your budget request $15 million for us to bring this project forward. Without getting too far into it, I think what's critical here is, GSA's intent is to make sure that we are operating our buildings the most efficiently. We're doing the best strategic investment we can do within our buildings, within our inventory, and at the least cost to the taxpayer. So we will work with the customer agency to, maximize the effectiveness of a project while minimizing financial impacts and we'll work with the Office of Management and Budget to say, we have this project. In order to make this come to fruition as planned, as per the scope of work, Agency X would need to bring this money to the table. Our GSA examiner will work with the customer agency's examiner to say, this project's proposed. You have this in your budget. Can you make this, can you find room for this in your budget? How do we get this to work? But we want to make sure that we put together a fully functional project. So I know that's a long way around the answer of, how do we know which is which? I would direct to our pricing policy. And again, there's the policy, and then there are sometimes very project-specific things that I wouldn't want to address within, the general conversation. David, I don't know if we can provide a link to the pricing desk guide for folks for reference as part of, the follow-up on this program.
Yes, we can.
Diane, Rebecca just shared that. I'm sorry.
Great.
She shared it in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. I can't see that, but that's perfect.
Okay, now we do have a follow-up question, another question if you have a moment. Is there a
I'm all yours. I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you all.
Is there a special emphasis area that helps fund the extra costs for work on historic buildings?
That's a great question. Very near and dear to my heart, especially coming from Philadelphia. The historic inventory in GSA, to me, is mind-boggling when we consider some of the landmarks that we have and the buildings that are eligible for or listed in the National Register. Every project that we do in a historic building, every project that's proposed, of course, there are costs that are associated with our undertaking the proposed scope of work within historic buildings. There is no special emphasis program per se for historic, but we do have what's called a Budget Activity 64, where funds that are provided from outlease in historic buildings, and that's where we would lease to, an outside or a private sector tenant, that any kind of funds that are generated from outleases, they become available to us in this BA64 program and budget activity so that the historic preservation folks in Washington, D.C., as well as across the region, can utilize those funds to undertake improvements, restoration, repairs, et cetera, in historic buildings. So while it's not particularly or specifically related to a capital program special emphasis, it is, there are funds available for that. And as I said, they're also applied within and accounted for in our annual capital program request if, in fact, we're working on a building that is historic, and they're accounted for in that budget request.
Okay, we have another question for you. Could you provide GSA's definition of warm lit shell and what that actually covers?
You know what, I would hate to, I don't want to lose my screen here or drop this because I would refer back to the pricing desk guide for that. But I think what we can do, and Monica, I'm going to ask you to do this, if you could perhaps either reach out to Carlos or see if you can pull up on the desk guide what's defined as warm lit shell so that we could provide that either during this presentation or as a get back, David, if that's okay. I definitely don't want to mislead anyone, and I would rather we would have the defined answer from the experts in that topic.
Sure. All right, we can do that. We
will.
can include that. One last one right now. how is the tier level determined?
So again, I don't want to take away from what the pricing policy is, but the tier itself, again, I think I mentioned before, there's the shell, and then there's the tenant improvement allowance. And general is based off of a construction dollar amount in the Washington, D.C. area, accounting for inflation, escalation, et cetera. And then depending on the agency type and on an agency, there are 7 tiers. An agency, say, could be designated as a Tier 2 agency. And again, that's based on, I guess, historic build-out in meeting the agency's function and operations, et cetera. So an agency that is considered a Tier 2 agency, it would mean that per pricing, and again, this is a layman's definition of this, and our pricing guy will definitely get into better details, and our pricing experts could probably answer this better. But a Tier 2 agency would mean that they are afforded, if you look at this as an equation, it would be shell plus general TI, which every agency is pricing is based on, plus 2 times the general TI allowance to address for their custom tenant improvement allowance. And likewise, if it was a Tier 3 agency, it's shell plus general TI plus custom TI, which is 3 times the general tier allowance. Again, the pricing desk guide that's shared with you all will get into that in greater detail. And that helps us. Now, again, I just want to caveat all this to say, sometimes when we're working with customer agencies on projects, new constructions, or a project that we haven't gotten all the requirements for, but through studies we've developed a functional estimate to determine the solution for repairs needed, et cetera, that we have a functional estimate that would say this is what's needed in order to address requirements, fix the building, et cetera. We have what we use internally, and this has been clear through our Office of Management and Budget, who we work very closely with in developing our budget. It's called a cost estimating workbook, which will take project costs and break them out per our pricing policy, per tiers, et cetera. But we know the project cost as a whole, and then functionally as a whole, but then we can also break it out by what policy would say with regard to GSA funded or FBF request funded, we call it, and then agency or partner funding contribution to make up that project.
Okay, all right. Let's go ahead, Diane, and we'll do the poll question, and then we'll move on. And folks in the field, just be apprised that we will answer all questions, either during the presentation or at a follow-up. So we're just going to move on right now. Okay, here is the poll question, and if you could give us an indication of your knowledge of the program, that would be very helpful. All right. All right, Diane, it looks like it's pretty well established across the board. We have 13% never heard of Prospectus, 33 have heard but not familiar, 33 somewhat, and 18% very familiar. So you've got quite a variance in audience.
Okay, as expected, and this is good. The 13% that never heard, then you can never say anything bad about me, because every time someone hears about Prospectus, they think bad thoughts, and then they think bad thoughts about Diane Campanelli, and next thing you know, I'm up on a board somewhere with some darts thrown at me. But you're going to hear, I'm going to use the term Prospectus. Folks may shudder. Folks may just be curious about it. It's not as scary as it seems. I've never met a Prospectus police yet in all my time of doing this, but we try to do the best for our customer agencies, for the taxpayers in general in terms of dealing with prospectuses and below prospectus projects, etc. What we're going to do with this poll, too, folks, is we're going to play this out a little bit further. We're going to go through various stages of the process and kind of build on this prospectus question, because when we talk capital program, there are aspects to it that are layered, especially for what we call prospectus level projects, and I'm going to define them in a minute, but it's not just the prospectus, it's not just GSA and the customer agency working on a prospectus project, but then there is getting prospectus approval, and then there's getting prospectus funds to support that. So there's a couple of layers we're going to keep checking back in on a poll with for this prospectus. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which again talks about the capital investment program. We talked about it a little bit on our prior graphic, but it's for construction and repairs and alterations, new construction, as we mentioned, minor or major repairs, and then I keep mentioning our work with the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, and that's when we request our funds, and we ask for prospectus level funding for those projects that are called above prospectus. For any project that has, as of fiscal year 21, we have a prospectus threshold of $3.095 million. And I'm going to explain that a little bit in detail when we get to the next slide. But think of this as a gauge. If we're looking at a project and it's going to cost us over $3.095 million to alter a building or to reorganize a tenant agency space, and again, there's nuances between recurring and non-recurring and agency funding and GSA funding, etc. But if we can just think of this in general, anything over $3.095 million when we talk about altering, building, leasing, which I'm not covering in this presentation, or altering space that we lease, if it's over $3.095 million, we must submit a prospectus request to our committees, and we're going to highlight them later, but we need to submit a prospectus request to our authorizing committees or the approvers, and we would also need to secure their approval for Congress to appropriate funds for anything that's above the prospectus threshold. So you see where it says Congress must appropriate and authorize, also known as approve, funding for new construction and major repairs and alteration projects. Congress also needs to appropriate funds for us for the minor repairs and alteration program, but those are below prospectus level activities, so we don't need Congress to approve individual minor repairs and alteration projects. You may see someone working on an elevator in your building or doing repairs to the exterior, etc. If it's below prospectus threshold, we did not need to submit a prospectus and request approval from our committees to undertake that work. But if it's above that prospectus threshold right now at 3095, we need to seek approval and seek the funds with which to accomplish that work. Here's where we talk about when you have a prospectus that's needed. For repair and alteration, we look at construction costs. Our attorneys always call it bricks and sticks. If I'm doing a project that's going to cost, say, $3.5 million to do, I'm going to replace a boiler, if you will. The actual construction work to do that, let's say that's $3 million. There is $500,000 or so, $500,000 associated with design and management and inspection of that project. It's the $3 million or the estimated construction cost that I need to look at to say, is it above the threshold? Do I need to seek approval? Now, in this case, $3 million is below that 3095 I spoke to. It's a little close for comfort in the event we experience or we get in there and the conditions are different. So we might err on the side of caution and submit the prospectus. But we're looking at just that ECC to help us, or the estimated construction cost, to determine whether or not we have a prospectus requirement. For new construction, we need to look at the cost for a site plus the construction cost to build to determine whether or not we need to seek a prospectus for that. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to go into detail, but I wanted to highlight them here. BA 53, which is leasing, that largest piece of the pie we spoke of earlier. To determine whether or not a lease is above prospectus or below prospectus, we need to take a look at the net rent, which is fully serviced rent minus operating expenses. And if at that point, when we look at that annual net rent, and if it's over $3,095,000, then we need to seek prospectus approval to enter into it. And then we have alterations in lease space, not very common, but post-government occupancy alterations where the estimated total cost. Now, in this case, we look at design, construction, management, and inspection. And if it's half of that 3095 or 1865, I think it is, if it's half of that amount, then we need to seek congressional approval in order to undertake alterations in lease space. I'm going to go one slide further and then pause again to just check in on questions, because just graphically, I think this may help you all see this again. FY20, 21, that prospectus threshold hasn't changed. It can change on an annual basis. GSA is allowed to propose a change in the prospectus threshold to account for market conditions, inflations, etc. It's listed in statute. The administrator has the authority to do so. We do it in conjunction with the Office of Management and Budget, and we have to notify Congress that we are planning to do that. Again, the Office of Management and Budget considers those impacts across our GSA's budget as well as the agency budget, BOEC, agency-wide. So while we can adjust that annually, it hasn't happened. The last time we've adjusted that threshold was back, I think, in 2016 for the 2018 program. We may be seeking to adjust it slightly, but again, we need to be able to document the need to lift that ceiling, if you will, to account for market conditions, escalations, and we use Marshall and Swift, local construction indices to help us identify the appropriate bump up. But we call anything above this dotted line, let me go back, anything above this dotted line, we call it above the threshold. Anything below it, below the threshold. And I mentioned earlier, minor repairs and alterations, BA 54, below the threshold. ECC costs of a repair and alteration being below that 3095. Major, BA 55, ECC, repairs and alterations over 3095. New construction, leasing we talked about, annual lease rate, new space, etc. So just keep that in mind as we're thinking of above and below the threshold. I'm going to pause here for a second. I'm sure there are some questions that are coming up. David, anything that you want to just highlight that we want to touch on now before we proceed?
Yeah, here's one. Do funds for emergency repairs come from the capital program? For example, repairs needed as a result of yesterday's earthquake.
That is an excellent question. So I'll answer that. I'll answer it this way. So, and I do hope we have been keeping a check on the folks out with our Region 8 and out in Salt Lake, monitoring the condition of our buildings, and hopefully, life and folks are secure. In the event of an emergency like a earthquake or a hurricane, there is sometimes, as we've experienced with Hurricane Maria and Irma, and there is sometimes supplemental funding that's provided. Congress will give us additional funds outside of our annual capital program request amount, so out of that like $2.3 billion. So we'll identify needs. We'll tell Congress, here's what we're experiencing. These are the buildings that are impacted, etc. Congress will issue this supplemental funding or disaster relief, with which then we'll address those projects with those funding. We have other emergencies that happen, unexpected, unplanned for emergencies. For example, if we have a building where, say, the fire alarm fails, it's not providing notification, it's either not producing the sound or the strobe or the panel's gone out. It's not a project that we had planned for. Obviously we can't house our customer agency safely in a building without undertaking very expensive daily fire watches where there literally is someone walking around checking, making sure, smelling for smoke, being able to indicate to folks. In those instances where we have unplanned emergencies or projects that happen, GSA has within our statutory language and what's typically found in each annual appropriation act, which we'll cover later in this session, but GSA has the ability to tell Congress, listen, there's an emergency. Again, my fire alarm example. The fire alarm in this building has failed. GSA needs to undertake immediate repairs for this. We're going to utilize small project funds in the interim, but we are also going to utilize some savings we may have. Every time we secure funds in the capital program for a construction or repair and alteration project, obviously we want to make sure that we deliver as the customer agency needs, per their requirements, on time, on schedule, at or below budget. If there are opportunities where we've experienced some savings within a project, those savings get returned to central office, and that pot of funds, we call it our uses pot or our sources pot, becomes available to us for emergencies or for other unplanned activities. So we would say, Congress, we saved money over here on the Dave Hofstetter project. We're going to take those savings and apply it to this building. We need your approval to do so. Emergencies don't require prospectus approval. It's a letter to Congress and their approval to utilize the funds. Again, depending on the color of money, if it was new construction funds that we had saved and we want to use it now on a repair project, we need Congress to approve what's called the transfer. But we have various ways to address emergencies. I've not heard nothing as of 2 o'clock this afternoon whether or not there was going to be any kind of supplemental funding for the earthquake. But, you know, it depends on where we land with that. If that comes out, we'll utilize funding there. If we have to utilize fundings that we have in hand, both below, you know, in the BA-54 or other funding, we're going to figure out how to address those concerns.
Okay.
I'm going to go.
We do have a number of other questions, but I think we're going to have to move on a bit, and we'll answer those questions either at the end or separately.
Yeah, that's good. I was going to say, let's go through this because I do know we still have a lot to cover, but there are lots of questions. We'll address them later. I want to talk about, as we mentioned too, we have those projects, those programs, new construction, repairs and alterations. You may wonder too, how do you know that there's a project that's associated with these types of programs? Land Ports of Entry, Customs and Border Patrol does a 5-year plan every year where they identify in priority order those borders that need to be improved, expanded, etc. The courts, they have what's called their CPP or their courthouse priority program. The Judiciary 5-year plan, we used to call it. They indicate where they need to construct or repair and alter or annex new courthouses. We have, for other ones, we have customer requirements that would drive a new construction, directives that come down, remediation requirements, opportunities to purchase or a purchase opportunity within an existing lease. For minor repairs, we look at what we know about the buildings through our daily and ongoing review and operation of the building, as well as customer needs, any kind of prior funds that we've received for repairs and alterations, the minor program, we typically follow a historic request amount for that program. Special emphasis projects can come from studies, regionally identified, customer agency identified, as well as consolidation, fire and life safety, court security, etc. And for major repairs and alterations, they come from our what we call the local portfolio plans or integrated planning. They could come from regionally identified projects, studies that have been undertaken on our buildings, customer agency requirements, evaluating our inventory, our biannual condition survey, PCS, or the building automation, and the BAT system that we use. So we have various sources that help us to identify when we're going to undertake a project. Typically it's either building-driven project or a customer-driven project. So that's for identification. This, again, we talk about this a little bit more. We go through these various studies as well as the teams. Every region has an asset management group that is constantly evaluating the assets within their geographical area. Every agency within GSA, we have our customer account executives who keep that thread going across the regions, etc. So we have these assessments and planning efforts going on both at the central office level, at the region level, back and forth, and with the customer agencies. So we also have subject matter experts that assist us as we work through subject-specific or scope-specific type projects. After we've nailed down which type of program we have, we've identified the projects, I do want to talk about that there are selection criteria. As you can imagine, $2 to $2.3 billion a year requested in our budget. It sounds like a lot of dollars, and I don't want to minimize it at all. But as we mentioned earlier, there's 1,500 government-owned buildings close to 50 years old. We have agencies in lease space that want to come in federal space. We want to maximize the use of those buildings. There is a lot of need out there and not necessarily a lot of money to go with it. So we need to figure out how we prioritize and select which projects are going to go forward in a given budget year request, as well as in our 5-year plan, because there's always more needs than there will be money. So we look to, for court projects, for the courts, we look for the courts priorities. For CBP, we used to call it the port priorities. They got courts and ports. For other new construction as well as repairs and alterations, we use a tool that's called Decision Lens, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But we also look for opportunities for strategic investment, least cost avoidance, complying with local codes, reducing risks for seismic, reducing risk for fire and life safety, etc., customer agency priorities, and again, strategic capital investment. So every project is looked at with these various lenses, and we utilize this tool, decision-making tool, which Decision Lens, to help us prioritize those projects. It's a cloud-based system that we use that helps us repetitively and are able to show folks how we've utilized this software for decision-making. We develop a model with input from stakeholders across the nation, PBS senior leadership, our business lines, portfolio folks in the regions, as well as the Office of Management and Budget. For repairs and alteration projects, we look to make sure that how are these projects addressing these criteria? How are we looking at customer priorities in terms of serving our partners? How are we addressing liabilities within a building, repairing that backlog? How are we supporting least cost avoidance or agency rent savings for projects that promote economic development? We want to make sure that we're recapturing and utilizing vacant space. We want to make sure, too, as I mentioned, are we compliant with code? Have we addressed accessibility issues, seismic risk, historic status? And then asset performance, those 1,500 federal buildings, is this an asset that we want to keep in our inventory? Will it continue for the long term meet the needs of that customer agency or the government as a whole? We need to take that into account when we consider whether or not we're going to undertake a repair and alteration project in that building. New construction, similar criteria, but it's unique. You're looking at creating a new project or building a new federal building. How does this fit in with the agency's priority and master plans? What does it mean in terms of a building that we're going to be either disposing or releasing or have a follow-on repair and alteration project in? How does it work within the community that we're in? In terms of dollars, does this provide an opportunity for us to avoid very expensive leases, improve the return on investment? For $100 million that we put in here, we'd be saving the American taxpayer $200 million over the long term. We also look for ways to new construction that would help us recapture space that's out in the lease market, improve space within a federal building, for example, by perhaps consolidating into a federal building but putting the other requirements or some of the requirements in that building into a new building. So we have various things that we keep in mind as we're doing this evaluation. And I want to show you graphically on this next page what Decision Lens helps us to do. We look at those criteria as we talked about, and each one of those criteria gets a weight. When we start looking at projects and we enter each project into our Decision Lens tool, and in this case, the top scale is for customer priority. And we say, okay, I'll use SSA as an example. Nationwide, we're considering, I'll say, 10 projects in a given budget year. But we work through our partners in the region, our customer engagement execs, to say to SSA, which one of these is your priority? You got moving and leases going on here. You got repairs and alteration in one of these federal buildings. We'll try to account for those priorities. So if, for example, this project is the SSA's #1 priority nationwide, it would get this value of 1. It gets the highest weight for this customer priority criteria. Like utilization would be a next one. Does this project help us to improve utilization by, 1 to 5%? It would get 0.25% of the weight. If it's over 15%, it gets more of the weight. So as we go through these various criteria and we apply these criteria to every project, Decision Lens helps us to come up with this rating. So for example, what you see here says Region 1, this proposed project, this example. What's in blue is one criteria, and it got that much weight of the project. There's another criteria, the yellow, the purple. When you combine all these criteria, it says all things being equal for these projects, this one is providing, or it's hitting most of these marks in terms of what we would use to select a project. I want to tell you it's repeatable. It's something that we're able to demonstrate to our stakeholders as to how we're selecting projects, because you can't fund them all. Help us identify how we come forward with these projects. It is one part of this process. I call it this is the science behind it. I can show you how these things play out. There are things that we call the art that goes on top of this, which will be, how are we seeing, what are we getting from Congress in terms of, how are we seeing the budget's going to play out for either the prior year or a future year? Do we need to try to adjust things and layer on, an additional thought outside of the Decision Lens tool? Is there an administration priority that would maybe say, we may need to pump up, for example, seismic and increase that rating so that we address more of our exceptionally high-risk buildings, etc. But this Decision Lens tool is key for us in determining how to help prioritize that list of projects that is in excess of what we believe we can secure in funding on a given year. I'm going to pause for a second and I want to show you this, but I want Dave to take one more poll, and then we'll have one more after this. And Dave, if you could ask the next poll question with regard to our continued inquiry on prospectuses.
Okay, sure. If you get that question on. Have you worked with GSA on a prospectus level project?
Yeah, so it's a, how many have heard of it? Have you worked with us on a prospectus level project?
All right. And Monica, do you want to comment?
So it looks like about 65% has not worked with GSA on a prospectus level project.
Oh, okay, well that's good. It's not good or bad, but it's surprising. And again, as I mentioned earlier, everyone hears prospectus level and everyone starts, there's a bit of a panic because it is a process, as you can see through this. But it's a very deliberative process, and it engages our customers, our stakeholders. We just want to get a sense of, how familiar you are with this. Everything we've talked about thus far, project identification, selection criteria, selection of the project. On an annual basis, it helps us boil down to this. What you see in front of you is GSA's FY 2021 capital program budget list. It's part of GSA's overall $10+ billion request. But after we've gone through all that identification, all the planning, coordination with the agencies, evaluating criteria, selecting which projects to put forward, at the end of GSA's 21 budget development, we came forward with a $1.3 billion major minor repair and alteration budget request and a $762 million new construction request. I can tell you, when Monica, myself, and our team members started, we started with over $4 billion worth of identified project needs, program needs, and opportunities. So that $4 billion through evaluation, criteria, decision lens, overlays, boiled down to this $2.132 billion program between new construction and repair and alteration. I said we turned the word about prospectus. What's all this we hear about needing a prospectus? We usually hear that on projects. Everybody's like, what's this mean? What do I need a prospectus for? Written in Act, USC 40 Code USC 3307. No appropriation, no funds can be made to repair, alter, construct, acquire any building or lease space which involves a total expenditure of over $1.5 million annually if it's not been approved by resolutions, we talked about this earlier, adopted by the House and Senate. The 1.5, yeah?
Diane, we lost your screen.
Yeah.
Okay, let me try it again. It looks like we may be, I'm going to try it again, folks, see what's going on here. We're having some internet connection, so give me 1 second. It says I'm still connected, so let me try this one more time, see if I can get you back on here.
Okay,
Can y'all see it now?
It's coming back up. It's loading. All right,
okay.
It's back up.
Okay.
Yes.
I apologize for that. Okay. So 40 USC 3307, you have to come forward to Congress, get their approval, what we call our authorizing committee approval, before you can even secure any funding to do these projects. As written in statute, the prospectus threshold at the time was $1.5 million. Mentioned earlier that that can be adjusted annually by the administrator. Currently, it's 3.095. So for the purposes of, securing such approval, we transmit a prospectus for the proposed project. And GSA's Annual Appropriations Act, that $10 billion that we asked for, or Congress, we asked them to approve our budget request, requires prospectus authorization of those appropriated funds. This is what a prospectus looks like. And I will tell you, typically prospectuses, depending on the complexity of the project, can range anywhere from 3 pages, 4 pages, to 15 pages. I've seen some of the most complicated consolidations, DHS consolidation at St. Elizabeth's in D.C., for example. But a prospectus really is, it's just a marketing, it's a summary document, we call it. It's this marketing document. 3, 4, 5-page prospectuses really are a summary of what could be hundreds of pages of studies and program of requirements and hundreds of hours of coordination between GSA and our customer agency, or GSA and the field folks working on the buildings. We get so many pages with which to be able to convey to Congress, to Office of Management and Budget, the need for a project and the request for the funds to support that. Typically tells within there what the project is we're proposing, how much money we need to do it, what the scope is, what the budget is, what the schedule is, what the building, if it's a repair and alteration building, what it looks like, why we need to do the project. There's a justification for it. We want to replace the fire alarm panel. The justification is because the panel is no longer supported by the manufacturer. It's obsolete, for example. This prospectus document is the vehicle with which we can secure approval by our authorizing committees, and then ultimately the appropriation needed to undertake that which is requested in the prospectus. Dave mentioned earlier, it's a process, and there's a path that we do this. I'm trying to show you graphically on these calendars here that it spans months, and what we try to do is just focus on one given budget request year, but there are multiple years in play at the same time. I mean, we're all in fiscal year 20 now, but the 21 budget's already up on the hill, and we're already planning for FY22. So there's still a lot of activity going on. But it starts with really us working with our regions, issuing what we call the annual CILP, or Capital Investment and Leasing Program call to the region. Regions will identify needs for repairs, alterations, leases, etc. Central office will review that. We'll work with the regions to answer questions. Regions will finalize their studies. They'll develop cost estimates. There's review going on. There's what we call these ROCO meetings, regional office, central office alignment, to make sure that we're all in alignment with what the scope is, the need, the justification. Constantly interacting with senior leadership throughout this process, doing deep dives on it, considering what's going on with last year's budget, what's happening with the budget that's currently on the Hill. Is that going to impact this request? Regions submit these prospectus and all supporting documentation that doesn't go forward to Congress. There's a lot more behind the prospectus that gets done that doesn't go up to Congress. Congress typically only sees that prospectus, that marketing document, and a housing plan, which would say, here's what the building occupancy currently looks like, here's what it'll look like after this project, or here's where these agencies are housed in multiple lease locations and this federal building, and after the project, they're going to be placed in this new building, and there's a backfill plan for the other ones, etc. Central office is always looking for projects. Is everything correct? Is it consistent? Do the numbers add up? Is there justification? Can we prove that we validated tenant requirements? Have we addressed, space requirements, unusual parking? Have we provided any details on lease cost avoidance? Have these been clearly justified, supportive? supported by the agency with which we're going forward for the request? Is it consistent with the housing plan? Does it support the request amount we're doing? GSA's leadership, as I mentioned, we're working with those stakeholders. GSA's leadership to make sure that any proposal we put forward in a given year supports our vision and mission to optimize the performance of our portfolio for taxpayers and deliver solutions for the customer agencies. We want to make sure that we have targeted investments to optimize these federal assets, enable lease costs, because lease cost savings translate into savings for a customer agency in the rent to the taxpayers, provide additional funds available to make any future repairs and alterations we need. And the Office of Management and Budget is looking, is this consistent? Does your information all track? They, as I mentioned earlier, they're going to walk over to the examiner for the agency that's the subject of a particular project and say, are you getting new people? Do you know you need this money? Did you budget for it? Is this truly happening? You know, OMB is looking to make sure that there's alignment between GSA's ask and the customer agency. Are these things written well? Is it, you know, can you follow this? Do they conform with administration goals, that of the agency, that of the customers? Because it's critical that we have this alignment. Throughout this process, I'll tell you there's a couple of highlights. September, as with all agencies, the budget has to go to OMB. There's a lot of work on the upfront. We know from September through October, November, December, we get what we call passback, where OMB tells us what our budget will be allowed to be for a given year. Then in February, the President's budget goes up. Every agency's the budget goes up in February to Congress. For GSA, that capital investment program, which is contained in our budget request, goes to the Hill. Those prospectuses go up to the Hill. Congress is looking at it to make sure this is the best value. We have our authorizing committees that are working on this. And then hopefully, as we work through these reviews and markups and briefings, come October of that year, we would have a new budget, which hasn't always been the case, but we're looking for, you know, the budget to come forward. GSA, there's certain things we can or can't do while there's a prospectus up on the Hill. We can undertake certain things after the documents become public. Anything that goes up on the Hill is now public. But GSA can in no way do anything that commits the government to funding or ties the government into a contract until we have the prospectus approved and we have the appropriations. These are our committees, and I'm going a little faster, but we have, as I mentioned, we have the House committees and we have the Senate. But within each of those sides of Congress, we have the Appropriations Committee for both the House and the Appropriations Committee for the Senate. And then we have our authorizing committees of the House and the authorizing committees of the Senate. The authorizers approve the projects, the appropriators appropriate the funds. We have to receive approval from both House and Senate, and that comes in the form of a resolution where I'm going to show you what that looks like. But until we have that, we do not have obligation to we don't have authority to obligate any funds or enter into any leases or contracts. These resolutions that I'm about to show you, they provide the funds. They tell the resolutions are the authorizer's way to say to the appropriators, hey, appropriators, we approve this project and we approve your appropriating funds in support of this project. And when you see the resolutions, there's provisions in there. They usually say, you know, they'll reference back to the prospectus, but they'll also say, you know, it could include a provision about cost or square footage or utilization rate or approval and in accordance with the design guide, or that there be no exceptions, etc. But you'll see that these acts and the appropriations are supported by resolutions. Here's an example. Here's a House resolution. This is for a lease project that's down in Atlanta. And here's a committee resolution for the same project. Again, they refer back to the prospectus, and it says, you know, we provide this approval for, up to 15 years of prospectus, which is attached and included in this resolution. It has to be signed. We need both of these signatures, both of these resolutions to come forward. One came in December of 2007. We had to wait till January for the next one. We have to wait for the appropriations to make sure we can enter into those actions. The appropriations, you can look up your own public laws, your own division within the public laws, but typically for fiscal year 20, we had seen this is, the Consolidated Appropriations Act for 20, and for GSA, it tells us, amounts in that fund, that federal building fund, can be used for these requirements, and it can be used for, construction, purchasing, for this land port of entry. I do want to just pause for a second because I know we had one more poll question. I just want to see if we can take this all the way home. We've asked you if you've heard of a prospectus. We've asked you if you've worked on a project. I think we've asked if you've had, prospectuses approved. David, if you could just ask the last poll question.
Okay. If we could go ahead and pull that up. Okay, here it comes. Have you worked with GSA on a prospectus level project that has received both House and Senate approval and was funded in GSA's Appropriations Act?
So again, as you're thinking about that, we want to, you've heard of a prospectus, you've worked with us on a prospectus project, you've got these two resolutions, and lo and behold, we received the funds within our Annual Appropriations Act to undertake the project.
So based on the results, it looks like about 70% have not worked with GSA on a prospectus level project that has received both House and Senate approval and was funded in GSA Appropriation Act.
Yeah, and that's what I thought. Again, remember, minor repairs don't require prospectus approval, but GSA does expend over $300 million annually to undertake repairs in our federal buildings. So we are still able to make necessary repairs to ensure the safety and occupancy of those buildings. But for those large projects, those large prospectus level ones, you saw at the outset, we've asked for appropriations in years, and over the past several years, our federal building fund and the approval and appropriations have been underfunded by several $billion. So it's not unusual that prospectus level projects, depending on the amount of appropriations we received, they don't always get funded. They don't always get approved either, and we find ourselves resubmitting, for a year, a next year, and then we see, too, we're leasing over $5.5 billion of our annual budget. Those prospectuses, if they're above prospectus level leases, they need to be approved. The one thing about leasing is we don't get line item authority by lease for prospectuses. We get that lump sum, $5.5 billion, to ensure that we're able to meet that contractual obligation for leases. So you won't see an individual line item for a lease like you do for, say, this land port of entry in San Luis. I'm going to stop for a second because I think this is the end of the presentation, but David, I don't know if we have time. If we have time for questions, or of course we certainly will follow up with any questions. But
okay, well we've got a few that we might be able to get to just very quickly. Can we fund construction projects over the prospectus threshold with funds other than TC&I?
With funds other than what? I didn't hear that last part, David. I apologize.
TC&I.
PC&I. I will tell you we can fund prospectus level projects if, for example, an agency brings forward what we call the reimbursable work authorization, or the RWA, what we call partner funding. If an agency comes forward and says, I'm giving you $50 million in RWA to do this project, could be $50 million over and above, say, below prospectus level funding that GSA brings to the table. If an agency can certify that their funds are available for the purpose for which that RWA is presented, we can utilize those funds without seeking approval from our authorizing committees. GSA's authorizing committees, House T&I, Senate EPW, they have no say in funds that have already been appropriated for an agency. So we can do prospectus level projects through other vehicles other than GSA's appropriations process.
Okay. I think we probably need to, unfortunately, wrap this incredible presentation up. I'd like to really thank Diane for a super presentation. We also want to thank all of you, our clients, who were able to join us. As we mentioned, we will post formal written responses to all of the questions and comments that you posted in our chat pane as a frequently asked question document for future reference on our website, www.gsa.gov/CES. Now we have some additional presentations coming up, and as you can see on the slide, e-Rita is on the 14th of April. Then we have the Principles of Project Management on the 23rd of April. Please make sure that you register now for them. As we've indicated, the goal of the Client Enrichment Series is to engage our audience in workplace topics that contribute to your mission success and to your effective management of your real estate and workplace programs. I think we've done a super job on that today, and we'll continue on with these programs in the future. Diane, any last words from you?
No, David, I'd just like to thank everyone again for their time and their interest in the topic. You're going to share all this information. My contact information is up there. I'm happy to field any other questions. I'll definitely work with Dave and Andrea and the Client Enrichment Series team to make sure that information is provided to all. And again, I just want to make sure that everyone stays safe and healthy. And again, any questions, we're here to help.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks everyone in the audience. And as Diane mentioned, stay safe.